welcome. Thank you to everyone who joined us today to discuss antibiotic resistance. We are all very happy to participate in this session. I think we will start now. So to answer your questions today, we have with us Didier Mazel. He's the head of the Bacterial Genome Plasticity Unit at the Institut Pasteur and director of this MOOC. We also have Philippe Glaser. He's the head of the Ecology and Evolution of Antibiotic Resistance team at the Institut Pasteur and the MOOC speaker. And we also have Dominique Franco. He's advisor of the MOOC, professor in surgery, and he participated in the creation of the Institut Pasteur MOOC. And I am Manon Lang, community manager for this MOOC, and I work with Didier as a postdoc on antibiotic improvement. So during this session, we will address the questions that were asked in the registration form on the Zoom link. But you can also ask additional questions in the chat. If we have time, we will answer it during this session later. But if we run out of time, I will republish them in the forum on the FUN platform. And also, you can ask the question in French if you are more comfortable. So let's start with the first question. The first question is actually on virus. The question is, antibacterial has no effect on a virus. Why don't we improve antibiotic molecules to obtain the same effect on virus?
Okay, so I can answer if you want. So in fact, the mechanism of life of virus and bacteria are totally different. And it's not possible to have antibiotics that will both fight against bacteria and viruses. But you need to have some specific molecules that will allow to destroy, to kill the viruses, and these are antiviral molecules. So antiviral and antibiotics are different therapeutics. Okay.
Thank you, Philippe. I don't know if Didier or Dominique want to complete this answer.
No, that's just
okay.
fine.
Okay. So second question, which infectious disease is the most resistant to antibiotic?
Philippe? So in fact, there are, when there is an infection, there are three different aspects. The first one is where is the infection? For example, if it's in the lung or if it's in a bone, or the second one is the bacteria. So if it's, let's say, Klebsiella, Pseudomonas, Staphylococcus, so they will react differently to different antibiotics. And then the last point, if they have acquired some resistance mechanisms. And so all three makes some infections more difficult to treat. For example, if you have a urinary tract infections, normally they are relatively easy to treat because you will have high concentration of antibiotics at the level of in the urinary tract. But if you have a bone infection, for example, it's very difficult to reach high concentration of antibiotics at the site of infection, and then they are very difficult to treat. So this makes things a bit more complicated. Then you have bacteria that are more prone to be very resistant, and well-known are Klebsiella pneumoniae or Acinetobacter or Pseudomonas. And a bacteria that is, in fact, killing a lot, that is the major cause of infection, E. coli, is frequently less resistant than the all three other bacteria, but they are more virulent. So in summary, when you have an infection, there are these two factors. There is the virulence of the bacteria and also the resistance. And when you combine the both, it will mean how it would be easy or difficult to treat the infection. So just to summarize, it is not, in fact, easy to answer this question because it's multifactorial.
Thank you. Didier?
No, I said absolutely.
What I would say is that there is the bacteria which may or may not be resistant, but the site of the infection is very important. For example, surgical sites very often need to have a surgical treatment by itself render the infection treatable.
Thank you. So I send in the chat 3 links. The first one is an article from The Lancet about the rise of resistant pathogen and their impact. It's a really informative paper, so you can check this. The second one is the latest report of the World Health Organization about the most threatening pathogen, especially the escape pathogen. And the last one is an article about the epidemiology of the escape pathogen, so the most dangerous in terms of antimicrobial resistance. So you can check this. Okay, so next question. Can the presumptive identification of the type of resistant bacteria allow an efficient antibiotic prescription?
So maybe I can answer. There is one point is that when you are treating an infection, in most cases you don't have the antibiogram, so you don't know if the bacteria is resistant or it is susceptible to antibiotics. So what is done is what is called a probabilistic method. So you will use, given the information you have, the most probable active molecule, and depending on how serious is the infection, you will use more or less strong somehow antibiotics. And so this is why when you have information on the resistance of the bacteria that are circulating in the area, knowing this, you can select the most likely antibiotics that will be active against this infection. And by using somehow these first line or second line antibiotics, and not to go directly to the third line antibiotics, that will be the more efficient. But then if the bacteria is resistant to this antibiotic, you will have no more any choice to fight this infection. I don't know if you want to complement as a doctor.
No, yeah, well, I agree with what you said completely.
Thank you. So next question.
I would add, be careful in using the antibiotics, not to use the strongest one at the first time.
Thanks. So next question. As a very veterinary student, what should our position be towards breeder and related question? How can veterinarian really play a role in the fight against antimicrobial resistance? I think there is a chapter on this in the MOOC, but maybe someone can complete answer this question.
So there is this, in fact, for animals, there is a restriction on the use of antibiotics that are used that are important in human medicine. So they can be used only if there is an antibiogram that has been done on the bacteria, and if the bacteria is resistant to the antibiotics that are not in this restricted list. So this makes a limitation in the use of the antibiotics in animals. The second aspect is there is some way to treat animals. There is one way is to treat the diseased animals only, or to treat all the herd, and just to have some kind of prophylactic way to treat. And there is a tendency to reduce this prophylactic use of antibiotics to avoid infection. And finally, there is one aspect, it's not used in Europe, but it's still used in US, for example. It's the use of antibiotics as growth promoter to make the animals getting more weight rapidly. And this is so the veterinarian can reduce and convince the farmer not to use antibiotics as a growth promoter. And there is this just maybe a general way is to have a kind of education towards the farmer and towards the breeder to use less antibiotics and not to ask for antibiotics, and to have another way to avoid infection in the animals.
If I can add something, it's not only the antibiotics that are used for human therapy, it's also the same family of antibiotics. So for the glycopeptide, it's all the glycopeptides, for instance. And then there are novel alternatives to try to develop other probiotics that are different, that are not antibiotics, that are currently tested. I don't know, there is a message on the... So apparently there are people that raise their hands, but I don't see them. So do you see them or no? Okay.
I'm sending 3 other links. So the first one is new published this month in Nature concerning the use of antibiotic in livestock and the prediction, which is expected to increase in veterinary usage despite the development of resistance. The second one is the CDC recommended practice in the US. And the last one, this one is in French. It's from the government website. It's a question answer on the use of antibacterial drugs in animal farming. And you can also consult the ANSES website, which address all this issue. Okay, so next question is, how is the surveillance of AMR development done in France?
Okay.
Sorry, also we have a question in the chat. It is, what is the difference between resistant bacteria and recurrent bacteria? Maybe you mean persistent bacteria?
Okay, so should we answer the second question or the first?
Okay, the second one, and then we will go back to the surveillance of AMR. So the difference between resistant bacteria and, I think, persistent bacteria, recurrent bacteria in French.
Okay, Didier, do you want to answer or?
No, go ahead. I was reading the Q&R online, and so there are...
So in fact, resistant bacteria is when you are in fact doing a test, an in vitro test on the bacteria, and the bacteria will survive the antibiotics. And in fact, there is some what is known as breakpoint. So this is a concentration of antibiotics, and when the bacteria is growing at a concentration above this breakpoint, the bacteria is considered as resistant. And so this means that the bacteria is probably not possible to treat the infection due to this bacteria. In the case of what you call recurrent or persistent bacteria, so these are bacteria that will somehow during the infection survive the effect of the antibiotic. So there are probably different mechanisms for the bacteria to survive, meaning that it will not multiply, it will not be resistant, but when you stop the treatment, then the bacteria that have survived somehow during the treatment will start again to grow, and you will have the infection will start again following the treatment. So this is kind of recurrent infection. So you are unable to completely treat and eliminate all the bacteria that are causing the infection.
Thank you. I see 2 other questions in the chat. Maybe we can answer this one later. I wrote this question on my Word document, and I will ask this question later, but maybe we can switch back to the question about surveillance of AMR. So how is the surveillance of AMR development done in France?
This I can respond to this question.
Go ahead.
This is, in fact, there is a Santé Publique France, so the French Public Health Agency, that is organizing the surveillance of AMR in France. So there is 2 two structure or two, this is called mission in French. It is one is for this in the community and one in the hospital. And they are recording all these infection in different sites that are even susceptible or resistant. So they are, in fact, collecting directly the information from the robots that are used for the quantification of antibiotic resistance in the hospital. And so on a regular basis, the Santé Publique France or Public Health France will receive information on the antibiotic resistance. And they have some statisticians that will treat this information to see if there are some changes or if there are some local changes, because they know the level of resistance and they know also according to the geography in the different area in France. And this both for the hospital and for the community. So this is one aspect of the surveillance. And the second aspect of the surveillance is the National Reference Center. So the National Reference Center, they are collecting isolates that are resistant to antibiotics, and this for different species. This could be the gram-negative bacteria, like 𝐏𝐚𝐬𝐭𝐞𝐮𝐫 or Pseudomonas, but also Staphylococcus aureus or the pneumococcus. And so they are recording both the type of resistance. They are doing some whole genome sequencing to identify what are the resistant genes, for example, and the mechanism of resistance. And they are providing the information to the labs that have sent the strain. And they are also collecting this, and they can do some kind of statistics on the evolution of resistance in France, in the case of this, what is done in the country. So you see, it's a very rich environment for the surveillance. And in addition to this, there is some more local surveillance. For example, in one hospital, there is the hygiene department that will be in charge of the surveillance inside the hospital, for example, to identify cases of outbreaks due to multi-drug resistant bacteria, for example.
Thank you. Next one, specific question. So the email from this participant was this one. My concern is about a theme that may not be specifically addressed in this MOOC. It's about the resistance of Enterobacteriaceae and non-fermentive gram-negative bacilli, especially Pseudomonas aeruginosa and Acinetobacter baumannii to carbapenem. So the question is, what is the current molecular epidemiology of carbapenemas produced by this gram-negative bacteria in carbapenem resistance? And what are the carbapenemas of the metallo-beta-lactamase type involved in resistance in this bacteria in the different regions of the world?
Okay.
So Philippe, maybe.
Complicated question. So in fact, there are different mechanisms of resistance to carbapenems. So there are the production of carbapenemas, but also there are some other mechanisms, like for example, in Pseudomonas, you have mutation in the purine plus efflux systems that are activated plus other beta-lactamase and carbapenemas that will make Pseudomonas fully resistant to different carbapenems. And in the case of the carbapenemas, in fact, they are circulating throughout the planet, but there are some specificity. For example, in France, there is a lot of OXA48 and another carbapenemas KPC. It's relatively rare. And for example, in the case of Klebsiella pneumoniae, in France, we have Klebsiella pneumoniae mostly with the metallo-beta-lactamase NDM and with OXA48. And Klebsiella pneumoniae expressing KPC is quite rare. In Italy or in Greece or in the US, the main carbapenemas in Klebsiella pneumoniae is KPC. So you see there are some kind of geographical specificity, and it's not very well understood. And possibly it's possible that it's due to different in the hospital hygiene, because these bacteria are mostly hospital associated. In terms of metallo-beta-lactamase, today the main problem is in fact NDM that provide high level of resistance, and it start to increase. And for example, in France, there is an increased level of NDM among the Enterobacteriaceae that are producing carbapenemas that are collected by the National Reference Center. And this is the reason why there is a need to have some inhibitors against these metallo-beta-lactamase. And to my knowledge, they are not on the market for the moment.
Thank you. And I'm also sending 3 papers on this topic on the chat. A question that has been asked in the forum, it was, do we have any estimate on first, how long it takes for the specialist to receive the result of identification and antibiogram test? And if we have an idea on the percentage of patients requiring antibiotic adjustment based on these results. So I have the answer to this question thanks to Didier. So about the time after an antibiogram, it's 48 hours in town and it could be 24 hours in the hospitals. And the percentage of patients requiring antibiotic adjustment after an antibiogram result, we don't have a precise number, but in nosocomial infection, it could be about 5%, but we don't really have a precise figure. It depends on the infectious problem. Maybe Dominique have a...
No, I just would add one important thing. You don't have to follow automatically the result of the antibiograms. If the treatment is working, just keep on the treatment.
No, but there is somehow this it could be what is called de-escalating. So this means that if you do when you have a very, for example, let's say a septic shock, you will first use very strong antibiotic like carbapenem and vancomycin, and then once you have the information from the laboratory, what is the species that is causing the infection, the strain, and the resistance status, then you can use less strong antibiotics, and maybe you will move from carbapenem to a cephalosporin, and you will stop the vancomycin because it's only a gram-negative bacteria. So, and there is this in large hospital. I just discussed this at lunchtime. You have an infectiologist that will analyze all the prescription, and according to the results, he will either keep the treatment or it will change the treatment for more, for example, from a third line to a second line antibiotics, and so it's difficult to say the percentage, but it's an important aspect in the proper use of antibiotics in the hospital.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat. Why we can use gentamicin in livestock?
I have no answer to this question.
But it's used for it's used for human, so I guess that's the main issue. So
to limit
to limit the chance of selecting resistance in livestock, and then have more resistance transferred to human.
Yeah, it's in the list of essential medicine in humans.
Thank you. Another question from the chat. It's about a low-income country. How can we efficiently fight the rise of AMR in this low-income country?
I think like everywhere, first by limiting and controlling the consumption. So if you if you can get antibiotics over the counter, I mean, you will have of course a much higher selection for the resistance than if you control and if you give it only when necessary. And so one of the issue is also the reporting of resistance is in many low-income country and medium-income country, which have no efficient network for the reporting, so there is no real control. But what we observe is the rise of resistance in many of the country where you have no reporting system and centralization of the information.
Yeah, if I may add something, in fact, one major factor in the case of in low and medium income country, and this is the issue of hygiene, to have a way to treat wastewater and to have access to clean water, and this is a major issue in the case of low income country, and so this is but it's not so easy, but probably there is a major action should be done to improve this hygiene in very large city where you have circulation of multi-drug resistant bacteria. Because even if the antibiotics are sold at the counters, there is in fact more antibiotics are consumed by rich country, but they are using, and as say Didier, they are consuming this more properly and according to medical indications.
On that matter, you can look to the MOOC waterborne infectious diseases.
Sorry, what did you say?
Yeah, to this matter, you can have a look to the MOOC waterborne infectious diseases.
Sorry, I will.
I will tell you by phone.
Thank you. I hope I don't miss any question in the chat. We have another one. It's what can we do when we have a bacteria resistant to every antibiotic?
Pray. No, there are, I mean, there are, I don't know the word in English for that. Maybe there are compassional treatment. So sometimes you can use something that is not yet validated by the European agency, and I don't know, try phage. That's yeah, and your immune system may be able to overcome the infection.
There is also the use of combination of antibiotics. Sometimes it's improved, and or combination of phage, as Didier said, with antibiotics. And
yeah,
sometimes it depends also on the infection. For example, if there is in some cases, a surgery will be used to eliminate the infection. For example, if you have a, let's say, on a bone infection.
Is it used in France, phage therapy?
As Didier says, there are some compassional use of phages. So there are some kind, it's intermediate between a trial but there is some cases, but it's always used in combination with antibiotics. There is no trial with only phages without antibiotic treatment.
Okay, thank you. We have a question in the chat about phage therapy. Is it always a debate in France, phage therapy?
Yes, it is a debate, and there are, in fact, there is a very good group working on phage therapy in Pasteur, and this Laurent de Barbieux is really trying to understand why it can work in some situation, what it can fail in some other situation, and how to the combination of the immune system together with the effect of the phage. And there are some and there are some interest in different countries. There are some companies that are starting to develop a collection of phages and to have what they call the cocktail of phage treat some infection. One difficulty, of course, is when you have an infection with a bacteria, you identify the species, but within a species, different strain will be susceptible to different types of phage. So you need to be sure before to start the treatment that the bacteria that is responsible for the infection will be susceptible to the different phage you will use to treat the infection. So it's complicated, but there is some research and there is some trials that have been done, and there is in different countries there is an interest for this.
Another question again about the persistent recurrent bacteria. What is the mechanism underlying their survival to antibiotic therapy?
So maybe I can answer that. It's mostly they reach a state where the metabolism is decreased, and thus there is no harm done by the antibiotics. So you have to understand that for an antibiotic to be active, you need to block a specific and essential function in the cell metabolism, be it the assembly of the peptidoglycan or the translation or the replication, whatever. So once it's blocked, you have a massive perturbation of the cell cycle. But if by chance you were, when the antibiotic is used, you are in a block state in terms of metabolism, the antibiotics won't harm you. So you won't grow, but you won't die. So this is mostly what happened with the persistence or the tolerance to antibiotics.
Thank you. Next question. Did we identify any methods to restore susceptibility of a certain antibiotic in a resistant bacteria?
Pourquoi, Didier?
Maybe it's Manon. Yeah, there are several possibilities. One of them is to, and maybe it's in link with one of the questions that is on the chat box about the increase of the concentration of antibiotics when the bacteria are resistant. So one of the main problem with this kind of solution is the fact that you enter in a different area. I mean, if you may always increase the concentration. The thing is that in many cases, then the antibiotics become toxic for the host cell, not only for the bacteria, but it can provoke many other problems to the person that you will treat at high concentration. So an alternative would be to give together with the antibiotic something that will, for instance, render the penetration would decrease the efflux of the antibiotics, or would increase the capture by the bacteria to the antibiotics. So there are some options dealing with that, for instance, that may even either increase the sensibility of the bacteria or make an antibiotic that is efficient able to be active at a concentration that what is harmless for the person that you treat. I don't know if you want to add something.
No. Perfect.
Thank you. Next question on the question and answer. Do we have information about AMR resistant surveillance in animals in Africa, notably in West Africa? So if someone knows.
I mean, it's very variable depending on the country, but I don't know, Manon, if you remember Evariste. So we had,
yeah.
So there are labs in different countries, like in Burkina, that are doing some kind of surveillance, but it's only there is no. So there are data in several countries, but they are countries that have no, that do not give any data. So there is a review that has been recently published, which give the maps of the, I guess in the Lancet, very recently. I think I sent it to you, Manon.
Yeah, I send the link also on the chat.
You see in this review, the country that have a network and then can provide data for the resistance level in Africa, in West Africa, but also in the rest of Africa, and in the rest of the world as well, of course.
Next question, how can you compare AMR in Africa and Europe in terms of morbidity? And what are the factors that has led to the AMR generally?
So this I can respond. So in fact, there is a recent article that have been published at the beginning of the year that is somehow making an estimation of the number of people dying from antibiotic resistance. So they have done two different measurements. Or one is to compare the probability to die from an infection with a resistant bacteria compared to a susceptible bacteria, or the number of persons who will die from an infection due to a resistant bacteria. So just so the first one, when you compare the possibility to die from a resistant compared to a susceptible one, is more informative with respect to the resistance. And so it gives you, so maybe you can put the link if you have it, so if not, I will send it to you, Manon. So this is a very rich paper. And in fact, there is the difference between rich and poor countries is not so big in numbers. But if we go more in details, these are not the same person that are dying from resistant bacteria compared to susceptible one. So this means that in Africa, this will be a lot of children will die from infection due to resistant bacteria. And they would be saved if we would have used an antibiotic that would be active against these bacteria. And there is people that are somehow healthy in Europe, for example, or most people that are dying from a resistant bacteria that would that will have survived if it would be a susceptible one are mostly elderly people or people with underlying disease, immunocompromised person. And that are this kind of situation is much more frequent in rich country, and explaining why there are more people that are dying from resistant bacteria in this situation. So this just to say that, of course, there are more people that are dying from resistant bacteria in poor country, but we have to go a little bit more in details in the analysis of this number to really identify the real burden of antimicrobial resistance in poor country, meaning that what is important is just also to have access to the right antibiotics. So meaning that if you have an infection of a baby with a bacteria that is resistant to amoxicillin, and if you have only amoxicillin, you will not be able to treat this infection. If you have access to a third generation cephalosporin, then you have the possibility to save the baby. And the same if you have a resistant that is quite resistant, that is also resistant to third generation cephalosporin. If you have access to carbapenem and you can prescribe and give them in the right way, then you will be able to save the baby. So this is a point that is important. It's not only the really multi-drug resistant bacteria that are killing people, but resistant bacteria, if you do not have the antibiotic to treat the infection, will be also able to kill the person or to give a very difficult to treat infection. And there was a second part on the cause of AMR, or I think in the question, no?
Yes, sorry, I just need to find the question again. I think it was, yeah, about what are the general, I don't find the question. This one.
The general mechanism of antibiotic resistance is the use of...
Yeah, the factors that has led to AMR.
So the first factor is the use of antibiotics that will select resistant bacteria. And then once the bacteria are selected, there are other factors that will contribute to the to the dissemination of the resistant bacteria, that, like what I said earlier, this the hygiene, but there's also travel, there is population density, there are many factors that will, or even the climate. So if you have a warmer climate, you will have a higher probability to have transmission of drug-resistant bacteria. But this will depend also on the bacteria species. It will be different, for example, for pneumococcus or for gram-negative bacteria and enterobacteria, say. But the first factor, of course, is the use of antibiotics.
I think you just answered the next question. It was in the context of One Health initiative, to what extent can climate change have an influence on antibiotics resistance? So I think you just answered that. But if you want to complete.
Yeah, you could have some other events like flooding, possibly could also contribute to some increased rate of antibiotic resistance.
Thank you. We have a question on Mycobacterium tuberculosis. I don't know if some of you are specialists of this bacteria. The resistance linked to this bacterium is mainly due to the slow treatment and the use of a variety of antibiotics. Is the strategy of repurposing drug useful to find alternative molecule against this bacterium? And which are already put on the market for other indication. Is there any scientific research on this in France? If we don't have a complete answer, okay.
Maybe not completely, but first, I guess for Mycobacteria, every single antibiotics has been tested. So the main strategy now is to find, so there is a huge European program whose objective is to the testing and the development of new classes of antibiotics against Mycobacteria, more than repurposing drugs, because they have tested everything. And so the main issue, as mentioned by Zeynep, is the time, the length, the time frame that is needed for the treatment, and the fact that you have to treat people for 6 months. That's the main issue. But yes, there are, not only in France, a big effort that has been done for the development of new antibiotics against TB. If you have something to add.
Again, we have a MOOC on tuberculosis where you can find details about treatments.
Well, well done, Dominique.
Okay, next question. Does a control of antibiotic prescription in hospital alone enough to prevent spreading of resistance in bacteria?
I don't know if you want to answer, Philippe. I can.
I think there is this discussion on, maybe Dominique, you will know this better. But
The answer is no.
There is a discussion of the hygienist and for the good practice in the prescription of antibiotics, to really prescribe antibiotics when they are needed and to select the good one, to use the results of the testing of the antibiogram. And so this will depend from one hospital to another hospital, and because there are some doctors that will not take any risk, so they will somehow over-prescribe to avoid any risk of infection. Some other will maybe be more selective. And so there is quite a lot of freedom. And it is the same, at least in France, for the community medicine, where doctors are somehow they are free to prescribe the antibiotics they want. Somehow there is some incentive. For example, they could get some kind of prime if they are prescribing less antibiotics, but this is limited. And it's not the same in the animal sectors, where there is really restriction in the use of antibiotics and reduction. And this, during the last 10 years, there is about 40% reduction in the prescription or in the consumption of antibiotics in the animal sectors. Also because there was maybe really an overuse of antibiotics, so it was easier to reduce. But there is one point that is important also, is not only the amount of antibiotics that is used, but also the type of antibiotics. For example, there was a small reduction of the antibiotics, and then it become a little bit more stable, and there was maybe a little bit of increase, but there are some changes. For example, there was a lot of use of augmentin. So this is the combination of amoxicillin plus clavulanic acid. And this combination is very strong to select resistant bacteria. And it has been somehow replaced by the use of just amoxicillin. So there is reduced prescription of the combination, and it has been replaced. So this means that in the number of prescription is not changed, but there is a diminution of this somehow second line combination, and this is less efficient to select multi-drug resistant bacteria. So this means, again, we have to be, when we have numbers, we have to go a little bit behind the brute number of amount of antibiotics, but to go into what are the family of antibiotics that have been prescribed, and is there some evolution, for example, in the way the doctor will prescribe antibiotics, and this both in the community and in the hospital.
Thank you. I think this one is quite interesting. What about traveling related AMR spreading? Do you ever check your coworker who just come back from overseas, such as their oral flora? Do you think we need a regulation for this?
Well, I have an advice. Freeze a sample of your microbiota before traveling in South Asia or Africa. There has been a couple of studies that have shown that even if you are not treated for an infection when you are, so the one that I know was in Southern Asia, and in fact, even if you do not get any infection when you are there, when you come back, and if you sample your microbiota, you come back with a 99% chance an enterobacteria that carry all the very nice resistance genes that you can find there. So we know the answer. So there is no much need to make more study about that. So the carriage when you come back, but the good thing is that after a period, which can last for 1 month to a few months, in general, you gain again a sensitive microbiota, and the enterics that are resistant are evacuated. Philippe, tu veux faire un commentaire?
Just about one comment is that when you get hospitalized, you are a questionnaire, and you have asked if you have been hospitalized abroad so you could be repatriated, or you have been hospitalized 3 months, I think it's 3 months before your hospitalization in France. And if you have been hospitalized abroad in any country, then you will have a testing for the carriage in your gut of enterobacteriaceae that are multi-drug resistant, or that are resistant to third-generation cephalosporin or to carbapenem. And this was a frequent cause of carbapenem-resistant enterobacteriaceae to be hospitalized just abroad, and mostly in Southeast Asia.
Thank you. Another question from Haiti. The question is, what strategies can be used to rationalize the use of antibiotic in order to limit resistance when we can't do an antibiogram, specifically in hospital?
Philippe, c'est toi le spécialiste.
This is a very good question. But it's not, so I mean, there are a lot of people that are somehow discussing this point because this is a major issue, how so this is the good usage of antibiotics. So this means that to use the antibiotics when you need them, but only when you need them. So this means that, for example, if you have a sore throat, you can make a test to know if it's a viral or a bacterial sore throat. So if it's a viral sore throat, you will not treat with antibiotics. If it is a bacterial one, if it's a streptococcus, then you will need to treat with ampicillin, with amoxicillin, for example, because these bacteria are always susceptible to these antibiotics. So this is really the idea to use the antibiotics when you need them, but only when you need them. And so if you do, and of course, there are more tests that have been done in rich countries and in poor country, but even in rich country, in most cases, the treatment is given before to have the results of the testing. But there are some change in the practice. For example, if you have let's say a urinary tract infection that is more closely, that is not really an infection, but more a colonization of the urine by some bacteria, but it's not, there is no symptoms, no pain, nothing. Then in 10 years ago, this was treated with antibiotics, and today it's no more treated with antibiotics, except in some cases. But normally, if you have an healthy person, you will not treat. So there are some kind of rules that are given to the doctors to use less antibiotics. But of course, not all the doctors will use these rules. And sometimes also the patient will ask for antibiotics if they have this kind of situation. And so that's why there is always this discussion on what is the contribution of the patient or of the doctor on this kind of overuse of antibiotics. But the answer to this question is that it's a very important question, and it's not easy because it's easy to say what should be done, but it's not so always easy that what somehow is the best practice is really the practice that is used by in the hospital and also by the general practitioner. I don't know if Dominique, you want to add something or?
No, you are a very good clinician, Estelle. Congratulations.
We have many questions. I try to take different topics, but don't worry, those that do not have an answer, it will be addressed in the forum. So next one about 𝐏𝐚𝐬𝐿. Is the 𝐏𝐚𝐬 resistance now alarming in Enterobacteria? And is it due to a genetic mobile element or a chromosome mutation?
Okay, so this I can answer. Well, in fact, there is this MCR1 and all the MCR family of genes that have been discovered that could be transmitted from one bacteria to another bacteria. And this is a major problem in E. coli because it will, E. coli normally, it's difficult for E. coli to become resistant to colistin. But once it's carrying this gene, then many mutations will make E. coli fully resistant to colistin. But in the case of, as I said in the beginning of this webinar, E. coli is not so resistant compared to, let's say, Klebsiella pneumoniae. So in most cases, there are some alternative antibiotics that are better than colistin that could be used against E. coli. In the case of Klebsiella pneumoniae, in fact, Klebsiella pneumoniae can become resistant to colistin mostly by point mutations. It could be also due to MCR, but Klebsiella pneumoniae will very easily become resistant to colistin, and colistin is used against Klebsiella pneumoniae. So this is a problem. The point is that the bacteria that are selected as resistant, for example, during treatment, so of course it's not good for the patient because the treatment will no more be effective, but the mutation that will lead to resistance have a high fitness cost to the bacteria. Well, this means that they have a low probability to be transmitted from one patient to another patient in the hospital, except if the other patient is also taking colistin as an antibiotics. So this means that there is not this risk of dissemination. And this is different in the case of the bacteria that are carrying MCR1 or MCR, so the gene for resistance, because the gene itself can disseminate because it's carried on plasmids that could be conjugative from one bacteria to another bacteria. So just to summarize, I think there is this issue of colistin resistant, but it's different from what is going on in E. coli and let's say what's going on in Pseudomonas or in Klebsiella, where this is mostly due to mutations independently of the resistant genes.
Thank you. Question about the lack of antibiotic. This question is from Venezuela. In middle country, we don't have some antimicrobial drugs to treat nosocomial infection, for example. Which will be your advice about how we approach this problem?
This is a political question, and this is the access to medicine. It's not restricted to antibiotics. There are many molecules that are available in rich country and that are or in poor country or in medium income country. It's usually only available for the richest families and that are access to, let's say, international hospital, local, or they are moving to rich country for their treatment, for their surgery, for example. And so this is and it's really a very important aspect, and this could be high in the agenda to select the antibiotics that should be available in this country and that should be made available. And one aspect that is difficult is that if you have, for example, access to carbapenem, you need to have some way to restrict the use of these antibiotics only in cases where they are really needed. And this is a problem not to have any antibiograms that are performed, because you can use the carbapenem. Also, the bacteria is still susceptible to, let's say, second-line antibiotics. And this, as Didier was mentioning on buying antibiotics over the counter, you can buy carbapenem like this without any prescription. And this means that you will select the more resistant bacteria just because you are using these very strong antibiotics when you can use an antibiotic that will be less selective for really very resistant bacteria. So, but again, this is a very good question, but it's not easy to answer. It's easy, but to solve this issue it's complicated.
Yes.
Thank you. Question, maybe the last one. Are resistant genes expressed at the same rate, meaning bacteria harboring, for example, 𝐏𝐚𝐬 gene will be resistant to carbapenem at the same level, or other factors can make it worse or better?
Yeah.
It's like everything, I guess. But there are, as far as you deal with enzyme, the expression is not, it's more a matter of affinity than expression. Of course, if you have no expression, you have no resistance. So if you transfer a gene in a context where it's not expressed, you won't have resistance. But for the rest, it's an enzymatic activity. Maybe the famous Professor Glaser would have something to add to that, but it's hard to make a short answer.
No, but just to take the example of 𝐏𝐚𝐬, I think it's you could have if you have more enzyme, you will be more resistant. And for example, if the gene is on a low copy number plasmid, a large plasmid, it can sometimes jump. So we have seen this in a Klebsiella strain where we have a gene that was on a large plasmid and with a number of copies that is similar to the chromosome, and it jumped into a high copy number plasmid that was also present in the same strain, and then the bacteria become more resistant to the beta-lactam. But the point that this, when it's increase the expression, it will also increase the fitness cost of the antibiotic resistant genes. And so it will have a beneficial effect when you have high concentration of antibiotics, for example, during treatment. But when you stop the treatment, the bacteria that is carrying these genes on a high copy number plasmid will somehow be counter-selected. So you have some effect of the expression. But you have some genes that are also tightly regulated. For example, you have tetracycline-resistant genes that are regulated by attenuation. So this means that these antibiotic-resistant genes will only be expressed if there is the antibiotic that is present. So you have this induction by the antibiotics. And one advantage for the bacteria is that the bacteria is, there is no fitness cost of this gene because it's not expressed in the absence of antibiotics. But probably a drawback is that if you have suddenly a very high concentration of antibiotics, like during treatment, then the antibiotics will not, the resistant gene will not be expressed at a sufficient level fast enough to allow the bacteria to survive the antibiotics. So it's a little bit more complicated than that, but you have some advantage to have a inducible expression, but you might have also some drawback for the bacteria, if we can see like this.
Indeed.
Okay, thank you. I think we will stop here. Thank you to Didier, Philippe, and Dominique. And also thank you for your very active participation and all the really interesting questions. I will repost all the address question that we did not really have the time to answer. And we will answer it in the forum, so don't worry. Okay, so thank you, everybody. Keep going with the MOOC if you don't finish all the chapter, and see you.
Thank you, Manon.
Bye. Thank you, Manon. Very good.
Bye.
Thank you, Manon.